Good morning, MATL students, and welcome to your regular broadcast on Saturday morning television. I'm your host, Robyn Meyer, and today I'm here with our special guest, Patrycja Magierowska. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Patrycja.
Thank you for having me.
Today we'll be discussing linguistic development. So if I understand correctly, Patrycja, there are a number of theorists who have actually worked on linguistic development.
Yeah, that's correct. So we have to first understand that language development is not technically a theory. Okay, it is, like you said, several different theories who have worked towards this goal. So one of these, like you mentioned before, is Skinner. He believed that skills like language were learned by imitation, okay, otherwise known as behaviorism. In addition to that, Chomsky believed that the ability to acquire language is innate. There's something in our brain that is wired for us to learn language, regardless of where we are from and how we are brought up. Next, we have connectionist theorist Poole, who believed that it was not an innate ability, but rather the ability to detect patterns in speech and language. The critical period hypothesis. This is the belief that in every human being's life, there's a critical period to learn language, and if we do not learn it within that time frame, we actually lose the ability to acquire language. So once it's gone, it's gone.
So basically what you're telling me, Patrycja, is that language development and linguistic development is an aspect of human development overall, rather than a theory. So tell me, Patrycja, and tell our audience, I've heard that younger children, particularly between 5 to 10 years of age, are more receptible to language learning. Is there any facts behind that?
Yes, that's true. They are more susceptible to learning vocabulary and verb tenses.
I've also heard it said that it's easier for younger children to master pronunciation in a new language.
That is correct.
So, Patrycja, tell me, if we go to the basics and we think about when infants are first born, what are the first steps that are taken towards language learning?
Well, actually, one of the first things that they learn are the phonemes. Now, phonemes are a specific set of sounds that are particular to a language. And these sounds determine the meaning of words. So before humans can actually learn to speak, they have to, as infants, first learn these phonemes so that they can later develop their language skills.
So in preparation for our visit today, Patrycja, I read a study on infants and language acquisition by infants, particularly abstract concepts, and at what age do infants begin to understand abstract concepts. So this is a study based on the idea of having an infant and speaking the idea of an abstract concept to it, and the infant had two screens in front of it. And at what age did infants begin looking at the screen that showed the abstract concept? So for example, a woman waving hello versus a woman holding an apple. So if the mother of the infant said, "Oh, look, it's the woman waving hello," at what age did children begin to realize that they should be looking at the screen with the woman waving as opposed to the screen with the apple? And the study showed that it was not before 10 months. So why is that?
Well, to answer your question, Robyn, there are actually two hypotheses. The first one states that infants must first associate words and language with concrete objects, so something physical, right? And only when they fail to do this, that they start making links with abstract concepts, such as the woman waving to mean hello. And this presupposes the existence of an object bias. Now, the second hypothesis states that abstract words are actually less likely to be used. We're not going to discuss abstract words. We are instead going to act them out at times, such as the wave. And therefore, it's harder for infants to learn what these abstract concepts actually mean because they haven't seen them.
When then can students or children begin to build their vocabulary?
Once they have grasped a good basic knowledge of their phonemes, as well as an understanding of both abstract and concrete ideas.
So if we consider this in a school setting, then how important is it for teachers to have a strict vocabulary regimen in their class?
Well, we actually see that children learn much more by inferring, meaning from the context to which they are exposed. So reading, listening, and so on, rather than actual strict vocabulary instruction.
So how should teachers go about teaching vocabulary in their classrooms then?
It is actually encouraged for teachers to teach vocabulary words and definitions by having students explain it in their own words rather than just simply by rote learning and teaching it directly.
But from my understanding, there are 3 common errors that young students make, and these are undergeneralization, overgeneralization, and overregularization.
That is correct. So undergeneralization is when the meaning students or children attach to words is too restrictive, and therefore they leave out situations to which the word can be applied.
If I were to ask a young child, what is a cat? And the response is, a cat is an animal who lives in a house. Then that would be an example of undergeneralization, because the student isn't realizing that lions and tigers can also be examples of cats.
You also mentioned overgeneralization. Now, this is essentially the opposite. It is when the meaning that children attach to words are actually too vague or too broad.
It would be something like if we were to ask a child to make a list of different kinds of fish, and on that list the child would include, say, seals or whales, because they're thinking of fish just as things that live in the sea.
Lastly, over-regularization occurs when students apply syntax rules to situations where they do not belong.
So, for example, if a student is trying to refer to a phrase in the past tense and he says, I ran to the store instead of I ran to the store.
That's right. This confusion would be created because as students learn about different vocabulary and different grammatical tenses, verb tenses, they remember that ed is a term that we use to talk about things that happened in the past. So instead of, like you said, instead of saying ran, they would say runned or ranned, because they are thinking that by applying this new knowledge, they're actually doing things properly.
And how important is the role of the teacher
Teachers
in this sense?
100% have to teach them about these exceptions. There, as we all know, in grammar and vocabulary and verbs, there's a lot of exceptions. So it is the role of the teacher to ensure that we raise awareness about all these exceptions and these different rules.
So what can you tell me about situations that I've encountered myself where you're talking to a young student and they're telling you a story, but you can't really understand what they're saying because they haven't provided you with the background information that's necessary for you to understand that story?
Well, Robyn, I believe you are referring to what Piaget would call egocentric speech. This is a form of pragmatics. It is when it is often present in young children, and it is when they are trying to orally communicate something, but they do not really understand their audience. Okay, they are not socially aware of what their audience knows or doesn't know, and therefore do not provide them with the proper background.
Okay, so how important is it for a teacher, for example, to address these issues and discuss with students different ways of expressing themselves?
Well, as teachers, especially with younger children, it is easy to let some of these things slip by. Perhaps it is an error that they frequently encounter and they think, oh, well, this student will simply learn. But it is always super imperative that we correct our students so that they internalize this and they understand that just because they know something and it's in their head does not necessarily mean that it is in their audience's mind.
So, Patricia, as we come near the end of our segment, what would you say would be the final stage of linguistic development for young children?
That is called metalinguistic awareness, and that is the realization that words and phrases can actually have more than one meaning. A common example would be the phrase hanging out, where obviously it means to be with friends, to perhaps enjoy recreational activities, and does not actually involve any literal hanging.
Good. So I think that it's always important, Patricia, to consider the second language learner in the classroom also. And I think that it's important to remember that, as with many other aspects of having a second language learner in your classroom, that we should remember that the effect of one's culture and mother language can have an effect on the language development in a second language as well. So perhaps things like cultural norms are different, and so the emphasis that's placed on learning one subject over another can be very different from one culture to the next. And so as teachers, we need to be aware of that, and I think one of the best ways to do so is to be aware of different cultures and to be aware of the students in your classroom.
You're absolutely right, Robyn. You actually seem to have a lot of experience in this field.
Well, you know, I have taken a class on the subject.
So yes, it is important for all teachers to understand that regardless of their personal opinions on the matter, their personal beliefs, or perhaps their favorite theorists, um, language develops with the student. And as children become more curious about their natural settings, their environment, and so on, they will naturally infer meaning to the things that they are exposed to, and therefore expand their vocabulary, their syntax, and so on. Teachers should definitely encourage this and not limit students to the strict classroom regimens.
Absolutely. I think it's always going to be important to remember that each child is unique and is going to learn in their own way. Thank you so much for being on the show this week, Patricia. It's been a real pleasure having you here with us.
Thank you.
And we look forward to seeing all the rest of you in future installments of vlogs.